Okay, so let us conclude our discussion of the Siddhartha, this wonderful book. And again, going by this copy of the text, I am starting and picking up, and we are going to finish up today our discussion. We are starting on page 113. This is with the chapter titled Om. So, Siddhartha's son has just left him, right? Siddhartha's son has just left, and Siddhartha's heart is essentially broken, as one would be, right? And so he refers to this longing for his son as a wound. And I spoke last lecture how appropriate a term that is, because a wound is something that's sore and tender and it's there, right? It's just kind of always there in the background. Beginning on page 113, this is after Siddhartha goes to sleep. The wound burned for a long time. Siddhartha had to ferry many travelers who had a son or a daughter, and he saw none of them without envying them, without thinking, so many thousands have the sweetest happiness. Why not I? Even wicked people, even thieves and robbers have children and love them and are loved by them, but not I. And these thoughts are very unlike Siddhartha, right? Because these would be the thoughts of the child people. And he realizes this, and he says his thoughts were that simple, without understanding. He had grown that similar to the child people. But in being so similar to the child people, this chapter then describes his affinity with them. It reads, they no longer seemed foreign to him. He understood them. He understood and shared their lives. Because now, where before they looked foolish to him, like their preoccupations and what they paid attention to, now he gets it. He's like, wait a minute. I understand them. They're not, this is the suffering and the struggle of life, right? Let's turn to page 114 in the middle of the first paragraph. And at times, Siddhartha even doubted whether this knowing, this thinking were so valuable, whether they were not childish things of the thought people, of the thought child people. And this is where we first start to get an indication that Siddhartha starts to refute even thought, which is interesting. We saw a shade of that foreshadowed before when he says, like, aren't thoughts also too bound by this world? Right before he started to go and seek all of his pleasures through the senses, he said, I'm not going to think anymore, because even thinking is tied to this world too much. But now he comes back to this idea that thought child people, it's kind of like of the earth, right? It's kind of like one level. On page 114, we kind of get to what I declare as a thesis for this book, right? Slowly blossomed, slowly ripened in Siddhartha the insight, the knowledge of what wisdom actually is, what the goal of his long seeking was. It was nothing but a readiness of the soul, an ability, a secret art to think the thought of oneness, to feel and breathe the oneness at every moment in the midst of life. Slowly this blossomed in him, brightly emanated to him from Vasudeva's old childlike face, harmony, knowledge of the eternal perfection of the world, smiling, oneness. This idea of the smile is not, just something to be glossed over, because this beatific smile is going to be the lasting image for the reader at the end of this book, where the smile was kind of the preeminent glow of the Buddha. And now when we see Siddhartha smile at the end of the book, that's when Govinda's going to say, like, oh my gosh, he got it. He's there. Top of page 115, down a little bit, it says, this face, when he... the river was laughing. Siddhartha halts. He leans over. He looks at his face, and it says, this face resembled another face that he had once known and loved and also feared. It resembled the face of his father, the Brahmin. And he's remembering now, and it reads, he, a youth, had forced his father to let him join the penitents. He remembered saying goodbye to him, going away, never returning. Had not his father suffered the same sorrow that Siddhartha was now suffering for his own son? And then next paragraph reads, the river laughed. Yes, it was so. Everything not fully suffered, not fully resolved, came again. The same sorrows were suffered over and over. Wow. Going back to that whole point of life being this cycle of suffering, right? But I really like the way Hess writes that, is just saying that everything not fully suffered or not fully resolved, as if suffering is kind of one of the parts of this cycle. And that really becomes realized, and as we close the book, that just like he said, had I not suffered in the pit, had I not been drunk and filthy and disgusting and greedy and a dicer and a lust seeker and all these things, I wouldn't have experienced that life, and I would have maybe always thought that it held some value, but now I know that it doesn't. Now that I know that it's just emptiness, and he actually referred to it as spiritual illness. And so that suffering some things is part of the resolution, right? And even in narrative storytelling, the story arc, the four elements of plot: exposition, conflict, climax, and denouement, or resolution. The main part of the story is what? It's conflict. We get to the climax 5 minutes before the movie's over, 2 pages before the book ends, right? The whole part of the story is the journey, the suffering, the conflict, the obstacles, the challenges, the feelings of doubt, the overcoming the feelings of doubt. That is suffering. And so it is part of the story, and essentially it is the largest part of the story, maybe. So we have to think about that a little differently then, maybe, right? Because he says that suffering is an illusion. On page 116, let's go down to the bottom. It reads, Siddhartha felt more and more that this was no longer Vasudeva, no longer a human being. And he's pouring out all of these things to Vasudeva. He's telling him all of the feelings that he has, even those that he feels guilty for having because he should know better. Things he misses, things he longed for, mistakes he made, mistakes he didn't make. And as he's looking at Vasudeva, he says he's no longer a human being listening to him. That this motionless listener was absorbing his confession like a tree absorbing rain. That this motionless man was the river itself, that he was God himself, that he was eternity itself. And jump to page 117 at the top. He felt that he now saw old Vasudeva the way the populace sees the gods, that this could not last. So at this very height of seeing Vasudeva become everything, the one thing that he feels that cannot be separated from that acknowledgement is that nothing in this world lasts. And so as he is in love with this spirituality and this wisdom and this contentedness and this peace that he finds in Vasudeva, he also knows that this is fleeting. Right? Like this pronunciation of everything being so ephemeral. And then Vasudeva says, to him, you heard the river laugh, but you have not heard everything. Let us listen. You will hear more. And so for the last time, we see in this book, the ferryman Vasudeva and Siddhartha, our protagonists, sit together under the tree next to the river and just listen. And as they listen, Siddhartha becomes really overwhelmed with this feeling of oneness. The bottom of 118, everything was one. Everything was entwined and entwisted, was interwoven 1,000-fold. And all of it together, all voices, all goals, all yearnings, all sufferings, all pleasures, all good and evil. The world was everything together. Everything together was the river of events, was the music of life. And I like that, the music of life. Carl Polnack made a speech to the incoming parents of the freshmen at the Boston Conservatory, and it's an article that you could look up. It's called welcoming speech to Boston Conservatory, and he talks about how the Greeks viewed astronomy and music as two sides of the same coin, where astronomy was a study of visible permanent objects, and music was the study of an invisible immovable objects, and the way that things move in us, that's actually music, and that the whole harmony of the universe and humanity was brought together in the idea of music. And so when Hesse writes it here, everything together was the river of events, right? Talking again back to that core theme that we have here, that the present is everything, so that the river has a beginning and an end in the middle, but it's always, always, always going. It neither sticks or stops anywhere. And that it's the music of life. And as they're listening to the river and they're listening to this rushing water, it's like they're listening to the music of life. When he did not bind his soul to any one of the voices in the river, did not enter them with his ego, so he's not making it about him, but listened to all of them, heard the wholeness, the oneness, then the great song of the 1,000 voices consisted of a single word, which was Om, perfection. Just as the Om hovered over all of the voices of the river was the radiant face of Vasudeva. And at that moment, Siddhartha stopped fighting with destiny and he stopped suffering. So suffering means fighting destiny. We suffer because we don't want to go with the flow, so to speak. We suffer because we try to control things too much. And when we don't get what we want, when things are disappointing us in our expectations, it is a suffering to us. and the suffering lasts for as long as we will it to, and that is time. So that time is a part of suffering because we stay obstinate, right? And if we can't resolve, if we can't get through suffering, we can't resolve those things in ourselves. And then here Vasudeva does what totally surprises the reader. I mean, he's kind of reached this pinnacle of enlightenment, and yet, bottom of 118, he walks away. When Vasudeva rose from his seat on the riverbank, when he looked into Siddhartha's eyes and saw the radiant serenity of knowledge, he touched his shoulder. Now, this touching of the shoulder is not an unremarkable gesture. This is a very significant gesture. I pointed to this in my very early lectures about how the Brahmin, the father, put his shoulder on his son as a gesture of acceptance, right? And when we put our shoulder on someone, it's a gesture of comfort or acknowledgement. So he puts his hand on Siddhartha's shoulder lightly and said, I have waited for this moment, dear friend. Now it has come. Let me go. I have waited and waited for this moment. I was Vasudeva the ferryman for years and years. Now it is enough. Farewell, hut. Farewell, river. Farewell, Siddhartha. Siddhartha bowed very low, and he knew it. He says, I knew it, because that sense that he got that this is not going to last, he didn't know how right he was. It was in that moment. As soon as that moment was done, Vasudeva was going to go into the forest to die. And the last image we have of Vasudeva is very important because it mirrors other images in the book. Siddhartha gazed after him. This is on page 120. Deeply joyous, deeply earnest. He gazed after him, saw his steps full of peace, saw his head full of radiance, saw his figure full of light. Peace, radiance, light. You remember in my lectures when we saw the Buddha, how much illumination was on him. It was his lightness, his brightness, his smile was glowing. The sun shined on him. This lightness is a symbol, right? I'm talking all the way back to the beginnings of form, light and dark. Light is good. Light is truth. Light is peace. Light is life, right? So let's move to the last chapter of the book, which is Govinda. It's titled Govinda, and we revisit Govinda and Siddhartha's friendship now again, but in a much different way because they're both old men and they are very different places, even further than back when Govinda still saw him sleeping before he went to stay with the ferryman. Govinda admits something to Siddhartha on page 121. He says, never will I stop seeking. So he's not satisfied. Just as Siddhartha was unsatisfied by the Buddha's teaching under Buddha in the grove, Govinda has been studying with the Buddha forever, has seen Buddha pass, and he is still not satisfied. He says, never will I stop seeking. And Siddhartha says to him, that you seek so hard that you do not find. And he asks him what the difference is. And on page 122, Siddhartha said, seeking means having a goal. Because anything that you're seeking, you're going to look for, and you won't see anything else unless it's that thing that you're looking for. So you kind of don't look at anything else. But finding means being free, being open, having no goal, which is exactly where we left Siddhartha when he said that he was on the bank of the river. He only knew what he was not, and he only knew he was not going back, and he knew nothing else. So for the first time, as I said, our protagonist did not have a goal, and this was kind of new for him. This is what he was talking about. This was the key to his freedom, this openness. Page 122 at the bottom, Siddhartha says, some people, Govinda, must change greatly, must wear all kinds of clothes, and I am one of those people. So again, pointing to all of those seasons in his life, all of those life experiences that he had that made him the Siddhartha that he is. And on 123, Siddhartha says to Govinda, when we lived with the penitents in the forest, I already came to distrust the teachings and teachers, and I turned my back on them, and I have not changed in that regard. So he still has not changed in his idea that experience teaches better than teachers, right? Bottom of that paragraph, he talks about Vasudeva very respectfully. He was a very simple person. He was no thinker, but he knew what was essential as well as Gautama did. He was a perfect man, a saint. And so Govinda says, oh my gosh, who's like Buddha? You seem like you're joking. And then Siddhartha says, I have thoughts, yes, I have insights. I have felt knowledge in me the way we feel life in our hearts, which means he's kind of like knowing things without knowing it up here. He kind of knows them in here. That's what he's referring to. On 124, his conclusion to that is what he says, wisdom cannot be communicated. And Govinda's like, what do you mean? Are you joking? Like, that's the whole point of wisdom. That's the whole point of, we look at Aristotle's, the rhetoric and the dialectic. We have the dialectic so that we have the rhetoric to teach the dialectic, and so on and so on the cycle goes, right? And Siddhartha distinguishes it. He says, no, knowledge can be communicated, but not wisdom. We can find it, we can live it, we can be carried by it, we can work wonders with it, but we cannot utter it or teach it. He says, I have found in thought that you will again take as a joke, but it's my best thought. This is it. The opposite of every truth is just as true. You see, a truth can be uttered and clad in words only if it is one-sided. One-sided is everything that can be thought with thoughts and said in words. Everything one-sided, everything half. When the sublime Gautama spoke and taught about the world, he had to divide it into samsara and nirvana, illusion and truth, sorrow and salvation. But the world itself, the being around us and within us, is never one-sided. It seems otherwise because we are prey to the illusion that time is a reality, but time is not real. And if time is not real, then the span that seems to lie between world and eternity, between sorrow and bliss, between evil and good, is also an illusion. So what he's saying there is you can't teach the wholeness of the world, because what you're teaching is like, only this is true and everything else is not true. And that's not true, because just like he's about to say here, 125, this someday is an illusion. Someday is merely a metaphor. No, the sinner now and today always contains the future Buddha. His future is fully here. You must worship in the sinner to you and everyone the developing, the possible, the hidden Buddha. No, the world is perfect at every moment. All sin already contains grace. All youngsters already contain oldsters. All babies contain death. In deep meditation, it is possible to eliminate time, to see all past, all present, all developing life as coexisting, and everything is good, everything perfect, everything is Brahma. Everything needs only my assent, only my willingness, and my loving agreement. And towards the bottom of that page, my note on the side was like the whole book is explained here. It is good for me like that. It can never harm me. In my body and in my soul, I realized that I greatly needed sin. I needed lust, vanity, the striving for goods. I needed the most shameful despair to learn how to give up resistance, to learn how to love the world, to stop comparing the world with any world that I wish for, that I imagine, with any perfection that I can think up. I learned how to let the world be as it is, to love it and to belong to it gladly. Those, Govinda, are some of the thoughts that have crossed my mind. And then he talks about a stone. He says, this is a stone, but perhaps it's one time it's going to be soil, and maybe from soil it'll become a plant or an animal or a human being. But if I look at the stone as just a stone, it's worthless. But since in the cycle of transmutations it can also become a man and mind, I grant worth to this stone too. This stone is a stone. It is also an animal, it is also God, it is also Buddha. And then he says, but I cannot love words. This is why teaching means nothing to me. They have no hardness, no softness, no colors, no edges, no smell, no taste. They have nothing but words. And he can't distinguish between thoughts or words anymore on page 127. He has little esteem for thoughts, he has more esteem for things than he does for thoughts now, because thoughts are merely words. And so let's just jump to what he's talking about. He says that, these things are paramount to me, that this contradiction is an illusion. The contradiction is not really things. Everything is as one, many-sided. On page 131, each was a desire to die, a passionately painful confession of ephemeralness, and yet none died. Each was merely transformed, kept being reborn, kept receiving new face, with no time between one face and another. So this is now describing as Govinda leans over and kisses Siddhartha on the forehead. He has a vision of millions of faces, of things, of death, of life, of birth, of suffering, of elation. And then when he looks at Siddhartha's face, he sees the smile. This smile on page 131 of the oneness over the streaming formations was exactly the identical, still, fine, impenetrable, perhaps kindly, perhaps quizzical, wise, thousand-fold smile of the Gautama, the Buddha, as he himself. And then, no longer knowing whether time existed, whether this seeing had lasted a second or a century, no longer knowing whether Siddhartha existed or Gautama existed or I and thou. The idea of self. He just killed the ego. You get it? He just killed the ego, which was his set out thing to do, but he kind of forgot how to do it. And so he kills the ego by seeing that there is no self. There is no me. There is no Siddhartha. Siddhartha was stone. Siddhartha was Buddha. Siddhartha is this, will be this, was that. So the idea of self is so vain and so temporary and so impractical to latch onto, because there is no I, there is no thou, There is no straining and suffering to try to identify yourself in what are you. We go our whole lives trying to see what we are. Well, that's a suffrage, right? That's a suffering. So the last image of the book, the last thing we are left with was this beautiful face. Siddhartha's beautiful glowing face. Govinda bows very low to him. Tears are pouring from his eyes. He feels the deepest love, the humblest veneration. It burns in his heart like a fire. He bows down low to the ground, bows to the motionless sinner whose smile reminded him of everything that he had ever loved in his life, that had ever been valuable and holy to him in his life. So that lasting image of Siddhartha, he made it. He made it without planning it, without plotting it, without knowing how it was going to come together, but he had reached enlightenment, hadn't he? So I hope you just enjoyed our discussion of Siddhartha. That is the last lecture, and that closes our discussion, and I encourage you in all of your reading going forward.